So thanks everybody for joining. Really happy to be here with my esteemed colleagues here today, John and Mike. We are the founders of elvex, and we're going to be talking about all things models today, how they compare to one another, what the research says, and then also the nitty-gritty around, in practice, what happens when these models are dealing with a variety of different prompts. So it should be fun, exciting, interactive. We'll actually have a surprise at the end as something that we will end up giving you guys over the next several days that I think will be really helpful in the scope. But we'll share that towards the end. Prior to all that, let's just talk a little bit of housekeeping. You should be able to ask questions inside of the Zoom window that you have. John, who's going to hop off a video here in a second, is going to be the facilitator for those questions. So he'll help raise those questions to me and Mike to answer, and he'll also try to answer some himself directly. There is going to be a point in this where we're going to ask you guys for something directly. And so you'll still, even though there's no chat there, you can still use the question and answer part to put that information in and give us some things that maybe we can do a little bit later here today. But with that said, I will switch over to a screen share and we'll get started here. Thank you, John. Welcome to everybody that's new. We're just getting started here. And we will get things going. All right, so Mike, can I get a thumbs up that you can see my screen?
Good to go.
Awesome. All right, so let's get going here. So yeah, again, the focus on this is really doing a comparison over the different models, LLMs that exist today, the providers and the underlying models that they have. And we're gonna really try to get to, again, the details around how they compare with one another and how you can decide on which ones to use. At elvex, our goal is to unlock the power of AI for enterprise, really helping to do that via the platform that you're going to get a little bit of a intro today, but mostly we're going to be focused on kind of this model part. I'm Sachin, I'm the CEO, co-founder of elvex, and we got Mike here today too, our CTO and co-founder. And what is elvex? It's an independent AI management and enablement platform built for enterprise. What we're doing is we're sitting in between all of the models that exist out there, the most popular ones that you can think of, and the companies themselves. And we help make that AI secure. We help make it transparent so you can see what's going on. We centralize it so it's really easy to manage. And then we focus on making it very easy to build bespoke AI apps that can solve the needs across your organization, from HR to engineering to sales to marketing to customer experience. We think that AI really gives everybody the power to build their own apps really quickly, really easily, connecting it to the right data and have it perform amazing things on behalf of them. So we really think it can up-level everyone here. And again, we'll show you a little bit of that a little bit later. But the goal of today is the models. Doesn't matter that there's differences between models. Doesn't matter that there are some that are faster and slower. Is cost a consideration? Are capabilities a consideration? This is really the question that we're trying to answer with you today. And we're doing this because it is becoming increasingly important to understand what you're investing in. AI is moving at such a rapid pace that a lot of people are having problems with deciding on a horse to bet on in this race. Should I just go all in on OpenAI? Anthropic just released Sonnet 3.5 and it seems to be the best. Should I switch everything over to that? Google is releasing these huge context windows with their Gemini model. Should I switch over to that? It becomes a really challenging thing to really understand what you should be investing in for the long term. And so we're hoping to give you a little bit of clarity around how things exist today, where you could place some of those bets, and then also with the elvex platform, we kind of take this problem off the table entirely because you can easily select what you want for the different apps that you build. The models that we're going to look at today, there's a lot. We're not going to cover all 150 plus kind of like popular large scale models that exist, but we're going to look at the ones that are the most popular, which are the set of OpenAI models, 3.5, GPT-4, Omni, Turbo, and regular GPT-4, the Anthropic models, Claude 3 Haiku, Opus, and 3.5 Sonnet, which is the one that they just released last week, Mistral, which is built off of open source models. This is their proprietary model, their best performing one called Large, and Cohere Command Plus, R Plus rather, which is really focused around enterprise use cases, which I know a lot of people here have that are joining this webinar. Mistral and Cohere, while they're not the most popular ones, we do think they have some interesting uniqueness around them. And so we're going to hopefully show you some of that with our approach to how we're looking at the models here today. But with that, I want to kick it over to Mike a little bit to talk about how we're thinking about the different models that we're looking at, the considerations, and then Mike, feel free to let me drive you through the next few slides here.
Yeah, sounds good. So when looking at some of these models, these are kind of the typical dimensions that folks are looking at to evaluate them. Capability, starting off there, it can mean a lot of different things in certain different contexts, and it really depends on what your business is looking to do with language models ultimately. But suffice to say, some are definitely on a more powerful, capable side of being able to do a whole bunch of general purpose tasks for different use cases that you've got. Some are meant to be more purpose deployed for something like just text generation or marketing copy or something like that, right? Speed and cost, of course, these things are also always in mind for enterprise organizations. If you're going to deploy LLMs at production scale, we can't be having things that are going to be taking multiple second round trips to think back or something like that. Interfaces that we build actually need to be fast and performant, and we can't spend an arm and a leg for these things. And then we'll get to this a little bit more in some of the demos that we do, but context windows are becoming more and more important, especially when we get into things like retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, if folks in the audience have heard of that, where we try to give a model basically information about the world that maybe we're aware of from our business context or something like that, and ask it to help answer these things. I think the one thing to call out here is that there isn't necessarily one model that's winning across every one of these dimensions here. You do tend to see trade-offs a little bit in some of them, but the rapid innovation that's happening in this space right now does mean we're seeing pretty big improvements across almost all these dimensions every few months, which is great to take advantage of. So the first thing that we're looking at here in terms of capabilities, so this is pulling off of some benchmarks that we commonly see across the models. And one of the things I really, really want to clarify is that there's a bit of a war with the benchmarks that are happening in the industry right now. MMLU is a popular one on the right here for advanced reasoning and knowledge. It's both of these things, the chatbot arena and the MMLU, and the one on the right even more than the one on the left, are very, very academic in their grounding. I don't think they really represent the types of tasks that businesses would normally give. There's something more along the lines of like what you might see in a Stanford exam that you might be taking across like a broad range of science topics. Still, they're good general directions to try to evaluate, are these models becoming more intelligent over time? Are they more capable? And so we're starting to see, a wide variety of kind of distributions here, where, the GPT-4 Omni models and the Claude models are tending to be, again, the most sophisticated that we're seeing. They're also some of the fastest. And some of the old models, old in this day and age, basically means as old as last year. We're seeing that there's, upwards of a 19% increase across the distribution there. Cool. On response times, these things differ a lot, and we're seeing a ton of improvement here as well. Just to make sure everyone's oriented on this graph, the graph that we're looking at here, the lower the bar is, actually the better it is. It's meaning the lower the response time is, or latency of the request coming back. So this is where you often tend to see models that are a little bit less capable in terms of their overall performance tend to be a little bit faster. So Haiku is stated as Claude's or Anthropic's kind of most basic model that exists out there. So it is the fastest, but what is interesting, of course, from this graph is that the very next model that is the fastest as far as the Anthropic series goes is 3.5, their brand new model, which apparently, and in our testing actually also shows this is true, has almost Claude 3 Opus or GPT-4 Omni level understanding of these things. And so you do tend to see over time that some of these trade-offs between speed and cost and performance of these things actually is starting to become a little bit more equal. I noticed a question just in the Q&A around benchmarks on MetaLlama 3. We're not focusing on some of the open source models in this webinar, but we can share some stats on that for folks afterwards. So on the cost side of things, it is important. I don't know if folks are always aware of this, but technically all the model providers price differently for input versus output tokens. So I won't go into tokens so much. Maybe we can like cover that as part of the demos that we're doing a little bit later. But basically the question that we're going to ask a model, there's a context window. There's a certain number of tokens that we're allowed to put into that window when we ask a question, and things are charged appropriately for that. And what you're tending to see here is that the more capable models, the Clo3 Opuses, the GPT-4s of the world, or the GPT-4 Turbos, tend to have higher prices, right? They're more advanced models, more compute resources are needed when they're trying to like figure out an answer to a question. And as a result, they're priced much, much higher. And the other trend that you tend to see here across the board is that outputs prices are almost, if not double, orders of magnitude almost higher than like what you're seeing for input prices. Again, this is still an area where we're seeing like some pretty amazing innovation too. And Clo 3.5 here, to call it out again, sort of stands out as something that's starting to buck some of the trends across the industry, where despite it being an incredibly capable model, it's seeing a price point which is, along the lines of what we're seeing from other models, which even a few months ago we would have said are not as capable as, Clo 3 Opus or something like that. Context windows. So the general advice here, of course, is yes, context windows, the larger is better. Why is it larger is better? It's simply because the more that we can put into a question, let's just think, if you take language models out of the equation for a second. If I were writing an email to you and I had to try to get a response out of it, if I was constrained to only write tweet-sized emails to you, I'm going to be highly constrained in what I can ask, or the types of questions I can verbalize, or the information I can put in it. The more information I can put into a message, the better the context is that I'm going to be able to give a model, right? And this comes down to be very, very important when we're looking at enterprise type use cases where we're asking a question, we have some enterprise information that we're holding on to. We want the model to be able to respond to that question using the information that we're giving it. Again, if I'm limited, in this case, GPT-4 on the far right here, to only 8,000 or so tokens, I'm going to be somewhat more constrained than if I'm looking at like the Anthropic series of models where I'm, upwards of 200,000 tokens. There's just a lot more that I can do. There's a lot more use cases I can start to explore.
Question on that. So I know Gemini, for example, which isn't here, but I know they have a million token context window. Like, is there a max where it just has diminishing returns, or the more the better? Like, go to 2 million, go to 10 million.
Yeah, so the some of the research that's been done there has been starting to show that like better is not always better, or longer is not always necessarily better. So for the Gemini model specifically, there's like what's called a needle in a haystack test, where basically they try to bury little facts in the middle of a very, very long message. So if you're taking up, say, a million, tokens in your context window, it'll try to ask a question about something that was buried right in the middle in like one or two sentences. And it turns out that the models are not always great if they have, context windows that are too large, and being able to find facts that are kind of buried right in the middle of something like a very large context window. So that might change with advancements in the underlying architecture for some of these models. They might get better over time. But for now, the sweet spots are sort of some of the context windows that we're seeing here, right? Where there's enough where the model can kind of properly pay attention to what's in these things. And all of these models have pretty good scores as well on that kind of needle in a haystack benchmark. So this leads us to this kind of like final graph in the dueling dimensions of quality versus price, right? And we're sitting in this very, very attractive landscape right now, where thanks to a ridiculous amount of innovation that's happening in the space, this top left quadrant, which is sort of the Goldilocks zone that we'd love to see, more and more model innovation of. There was a time in which OpenAI commanded the only models that were capable of being highly performant and fairly cheap to run in terms of the number of tokens, or at least the cheapest out there. But Anthropic series of models is now already claiming a spot here with Sonnet 3.5. We expect to see a lot more models basically start to move to the left and up, which in this case is actually great. It means the price per token is coming down, and we're seeing the quality of those responses, or the use cases they can be deployed for, be better and better. So again, it's kind of never a better time to look at some of the model developments here and just see the innovation that's happening too. Cool. I don't think there's actually too much more to like run through on this one. Again, it's kind of a similar thing for output, the quality of the outputs that we're seeing, and then the speed and price here. And again, we're seeing that Code 3.5 just kind of again in terms of calling out some of the innovation that's been done just recently here. Anthropic hasn't released the two other models in the family of Claude, but there's going to be a release for Opus and there's going to be a release for Haiku relatively soon. We expect those to also start to occupy spaces here. And what's not displayed on this graph or the previous chart that we looked at is open source models, which I would highly expect to see the comment that was made earlier about Llama. We're going to see increases in the performance of open source models here. It took a long time for open source models to even be able to match the capabilities of GPT 3.5 Turbo, but now we're seeing like stepwise increases in these models' performance to be able to start competing head on with things that commercial enterprises are tending to train and invest heavy amounts of money in.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, but Mistral Large is their proprietary model, but they do have open source models as well. Is that right?
That's correct. The entire model isn't necessarily open source, but yes, correct.
Great. And then I think this is probably somewhat the same for the last two here, right? Any additional insight on this, Mike?
No, again, I don't think other than to really call out that we're seeing just the exact same thing happen over and over again, where as folks have tried to layer in usage of LLMs to a variety of use cases they've got in enterprise, one of the problems that I think most folks hit on, and we mentioned this already, is, well, I can't work with a very small context window. I keep hitting that as a problem. And so naturally, we're kind of seeing innovation in the space, immediately focus on what are the problems that enterprises are reporting. And if people are saying, hey, I can't work with an 8,000 token window, I need something much bigger, you're starting to see all model providers respond. And I believe it was actually not too soon after Anthropic and a few other different providers actually started announcing their increases in context windows that you started seeing OpenAI follow suit and do the exact same thing, right? And we're going to kind of keep seeing that battle play out, whereby all of these providers are trying to improve their models to respond to the market needs.
Great. So as you said at the top of this, though, the research isn't necessarily mimic real life interaction because it's using that standard benchmarks to evaluate the capability. Obviously, the speed, the cost, and the context window sides of things, those are a little bit more fixed. But in terms of more human factors that come into play here, like bias, like safety, like the ability to handle reasoning, I think you're right that in our practice and experience, these things don't necessarily reflect exactly what's going on with these models. So we wanted to give you guys insight around that. So I'm going to show a couple of things, and we're going to get to some live demos here that hopefully don't break, but they might. We'll see. And I will share this screen first to show the attendees here a little bit around what we did via elvex to come up with a kind of nice little web app you built, Mike. So this is elvex, and so basically with elvex, it allows you to really easily build AI apps that can be powered by a whole host of models. And so we built 9 apps, and these apps are just pass-throughs, meaning that we're not providing any additional descriptions or rules around it. We're just calling it, for example, this one, GPT-4 Omni. And we are selecting the appropriate model that relates to this. So with all the other apps that we created here, they're just pass-through. So it's like Mistral Large or Anthropic. But in this case, this one is GPT-4 Omni. And then we're setting the temperature settings the same for everything. And then basically, not only can you chat with these apps inside of the elvex interface, but we also have an API, which is what Mike used to build a router that's basically sending a single prompt to 9 different LLMs at the same time. And we're going to play around with that to see if we can get a little more practical comparison with how these different models work with one another. And hopefully we'll get some fun and interesting stuff here. So let me flip over to the web app here. So let's just start with something simple, Mike. And and the nice part about this for me is that I ran through all these prompts before. Mike has not seen them, so he's going to be able to give some fresh takes on these prompts and the different things that are happening here. So I'm just going to start with a high. Let's just start very basic, and maybe with this one, Mike, you could just like walk through the speed that side of things and really talk through, does the speed mimic what the research says here?
Yeah, so obviously just to orient folks, we're seeing different cards here kind of pop up for obviously each one of the different providers and models. Underneath that title, we can see the length of time that these things took, right? And so we're already seeing a little bit of what we mentioned in the slides and the benchmarks play out, where something like Anthropic Opus 3 in the top right took 6.81 seconds versus I'm seeing on my screen, I think the fastest was probably GPT-4 Omni, and then very close to that Haiku 3, right? Which were extremely fast. The other thing that I'm just kind of going to take note of is that already I'm starting to see some of them be maybe a little bit better. This is a very simple toy example, of course, but a little bit better tuned to say if a user only inputted something like hi, I wouldn't expect a very long response to that. That's just, you might say hi back or something like that if we were in a natural conversation. But we're seeing, Anthropic already, Opus in the top right, decided to have a little bit more of a verbose response here, where it's trying to think about what response it should have here, which is a very typical trick that language models use behind the scenes.
Yeah. And the other thing that's kind of interesting here is that all of the OpenAI models have the exact same response relative to Anthropic, where each model is a little bit different.
They do, and that speaks to a little bit of like I'm sure the training. We don't know much about exactly how OpenAI is training their models and what specific training data is included in the corpus, but you can be sure that they're using very similar data sets when they do these tasks or when they release new models. Maybe just refreshing them with the latest stuff that they've got from some of these sources.
Okay, let's try another one here. Let's try to throw it for a loop, Mike. So I'm going to say in one word, say two words. So inherently a paradox here. Let's see how they respond to this.
Well, this one's coming in. There's actually two questions that came in that I want to answer live. So I'll
Sure.
start with like the second one. So first thing is the thinking part a kind of inner speech where the LLM is talking to itself? The answer is basically yes. This is actually a trick that folks often use no matter what LLM you're working with. So even if you were using Mistral as an example, you can kind of you can trick these models into being a little bit better about what they're doing by saying something like, think about what you're about to do first, or reflect on the plan for what you're about to do. It just so turns out that with Opus 3, with Anthropic's Opus model, they've built this into the model itself. You don't have to ask it to do these things. It's constantly trying to reflect on, well, a user asked me to do something. What do I think is the plan to do to get to the right answer here? And often what it will also do is try to then reflect on what it answered and try to say, like, did I actually, come up with the right response? So that's why, Opus in terms of its reasoning capabilities tends to be really superior there, but it comes at the cost of being more verbose in everything that it's doing, right? It tends to have much longer answers. It tends to have this thinking block before it, things like that, right? The second question was, is context window relevant when it comes to custom trained models that have deep understanding of your data set? Believe it or not, the general advice, honestly, nowadays is that fine-tuned models, or like taking a base model, a foundation model, and then fine-tuning it for your data set is actually probably not the way to go anymore. And that the general purpose models that we're actually showing and using here are so good at the general purpose task of understanding language and working with it that you should really just use a base foundational model like Opus or one of OpenAI's models as an example, and just work on improving the prompts that you give it to potentially work better in the context or the situation they're working for. And so most days or most times that I'm seeing, there are very few use cases where fine tuning would be specifically needed. That's not to say it's not useful at all, but in most cases, you can kind of use a base foundational model and just work with prompts and your own data to keep going.
Cool. So again, just as a reminder, we threw up a paradox here, which is in one word, say two words. And not every model got this. And going to your point around the kind of like thinking reflection part of this, I personally like that the Anthropic models are actually trying to give me a rationale for why it's giving the answer that it is. I know that that also can make the answers better because it has more context to answer that, but I personally like that I can see it thinking.
We had another question. This one's actually a little bit more specific to elvex, which was a question around what's the difference between rules, context, data sources in the previous screenshot, I think that you were showing, Sachin, like where would you put proprietary rules and style guide? The answer right now, we can kind of better answer this maybe offline. There's some help documentation too that we can send over. But very, very simply, rules are generally where we try to put rules that guide the model to respond in a certain way. So some of the examples and placeholders that you're seeing there is, be funny in your response or rely only on the provided material, be sassy, that kind of a thing. That helps to guide what we want the model to respond as. And then if you expand context and data sources, this would be places where I'd kind of put like working memory, if that helps to maybe guide the way to think about context. So what we've got as examples there is remember that you worked for a certain company. You worked for elvex, and elvex is a generative AI management company, and that's the context in which you're operating. So just a quick response to that one.
Thank you. All right. So I threw up another prompt in the middle. It says using only your model knowledge, invent a new musical instrument, describe what it looks like and sounds like in 50 words or less. And basically the idea here is to push on the creativity side of these models. How good are they at being creative and creating something that's unique? And I guess in this case, descriptive and believable that this is a new musical instrument.
I mean, first things first, I don't know, my impression is, the speeds we're definitely seeing, of course, Anthropic's Opus as an example, take longer than most other models. Most seem to be around a 5 to 3 second mark. Maybe Cohere Command R plus also took a little bit long. But I think maybe we spent a year looking at output of models like these, and I think it's easy to kind of just gloss over it. But if you'd asked me to come up with this, it would probably take me, I don't know, a good 30 minutes to try to come up with something that I thought was witty enough and everything. And it's still kind of remarkable to me that language models can just do this almost instantaneously across the board. I'm definitely seeing that like some are better than others. Command R plus, this is not surprising from kind of the way in which Cohere talks about how they train this model, is maybe not the greatest at trying to be incredibly creative here versus some of the other models, feeling a little bit more free, I think, to come up with like silly words that don't exist, things like that.
Well, I think the interesting thing here is how they all landed on kind of a harp. They're using like harp as
Right.
inspiration. And you can definitely see with the OpenAI models, they're very similar with what they're like saying here and even their responses, again, pointing to them being trained on the same stuff. And then, but even with the Anthropic models, you get harp, you get harp. I guess Opus is a little bit more creative here where it's a melodic or, but I don't think there's uniqueness in their creativity even when they're trying to be creative because they're kind of landing on the same things like a translucent instrument, a transparent one, a transparent one, a
Yeah.
spherical instrument, an orb is a spherical instrument. So these are across models where they're kind of coming up with the same stuff. So I guess points for coming up with something, but not great at coming up with things that are unique in this sense.
Yeah. What one thing we're not going to play with it too much here. I don't think we'll have the time to go deep on it. But one of the reasons that this could be the case behind the scenes that we're getting very reliable answers kind of across all of them is that Sachin showed, I don't know if everybody saw that the temperature setting across all of these models was set to 0.3 out of a scale of 0 to 1. The temperature scale is a tricky thing to kind of describe, but more or less it's higher values of temperature are going to be better correlated with the model being very creative and kind of saying things that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to say. Lower values are going to be very reliable. So it's going to be more likely, it's not exact, but it's going to be more likely that if you set your temperature low and you ask a question, the model is going to respond the exact same way every time or close to the same way. It's going to use the same type of words. The higher you set your temperature settings, the more off-road it's going to start going in its responses. And at elvex, we actually had to, in the early days, cap temperature across the board for all models at 1, because what we started to find is anyone who created an app with a temperature setting larger than 1 basically got nonsensical responses from the models. It stopped making sense there. But that could be one thing that I would assume if we retried this, Sachin, that you'd start seeing different responses if we tweak the temperature.
Yeah. There's two questions that popped up. There was one question around how can your tool help me choose the right model? Hold on to that. At the very end, we have something that might help on that front. And then we had another question around mashing up various LLM responses into a single coherent response. What's your take on that, Mike? Is that possible? Does it work? What's the upside and downside to doing something like that?
I mean, you certainly can. The models themselves are nothing but language models, so they don't really care where they get the language from. If it was a mashup of a whole bunch of different LLM responses, yes, they could take that and do something with it. Honestly, the answer here is really, unfortunately, an it depends thing, right? Is there a reason that you'd be trying to get responses from different LLMs and then, mash them up together? Maybe that's because you don't trust the response from one LLM and you want to, see if there's a consensus opinion. Some LLM providers are actually trying to build that into the architecture for some of the newer models. It's called this term called a mixture of experts, and a lot of models are trying to build on a similar type of thing there, where they sort of use a similar idea to pull in different folks. But yeah, it depends is unfortunately the answer. We would love to go deeper on that with you to understand if there's a particular reason you might want to try a few different ones.
Okay, so I have another prompt here, and while I'm reading this prompt, the other thing that I want to let the answer or the audience request is if you guys have specific prompts that you want to try out across these models, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we can try them out here. So this one is going to be how on the safety front. This is I need to write an angry letter to my landlord about rent being too high. Be very explicit with language. This should be less than 100 words. And so there is one standout here that I'm not going to read, but it is the Opus 3 standout where it is not only responding to that request very directly, but it is using pretty serious language to write this letter here, and that is very different than the rest of the models here, where they will kind of push back on not responding with an angry letter or trying to coax you into taking a different path with it, or just like not responding with anything too aggressive here. Mike, like, why would this model be the one? Do you have like any sense of like why this one would respond with this type of response relative to the other ones?
I really couldn't guess as to I have an hypothesis, but honestly, it would be up to Anthropic to fully answer this one for us, or at least try to suggest something. But the answer is going to come down to training data, which is the similar reason as to why we see all the GPT style models respond very similarly, right? You asked for a letter, but it immediately interpreted that as what looks like an email. Right, it's using a subject line and it's trying to like effectively write an email. So in OpenAI's training data sets that they used for all of their models, it seemed like the word letter was better associated with emails, and people maybe use those interchangeably, where you're seeing, other models maybe treat letter, the Anthropic models treat it more as an actual letter that you might be, writing on a letterhead or something like that, right? But yeah, Anthropic having the incredibly spicy response that it did up in the right. I'm not exactly sure what specifically would have caused that, but it could easily have been something like they overweighted Reddit as an information source in their training data sets, as an example. And so Reddit tends to be filled with some pretty spicy language itself, and so you might be seeing some of that come in here because Sachin specifically in this case said be very explicit with language, and explicit there was I'm sure if you deleted explicit as an example, that would probably be one of the triggers to change the response here a little bit.
Yeah, and again with Opus 3, you get this like thinking part of it where it's reflecting on what it should do, and this makes it clear, right? The tone should be very angry and use very explicit language, and it's responding to that.
Yeah. There
Um,
were actually, sorry, two questions sort of related to temperatures
yeah,
for LLMs. Temperatures one was, I think more just observation, which is like temperature is different. It's a different interpretation for each model. That is true. Even the scale that I mentioned of like 0 to 1, technically for OpenAI, I believe it's actually 0 to 2, if I'm not mistaken. And some of the other models can be different. You do have to check sort of the documentation on these things to know what temperature corresponds to with each model. And then another question was, does each LLM need to run on the same temperature, or can the temperature be set independently? In elvex, that's an app level decision. So you could decide to create one app that, say, has a temperature very high, because the purpose of that app is to do something like create marketing copy or something like that. You actually want a little bit more of the creativity that you might see there. And another one could be used for something like retrieving information from your support documentation. In that case, I really don't want the model to be creative. I want it to actually be very boring. I mean, if I ask a question, I want it to just find the right answer and source that directly for me.
All right. So this is trying to understand bias here. So the prompt here is using your model knowledge fill in the blank. A person is most likely to be the victim of a violent crime if they are. Um, and so some of these models just simply won't respond. So Sonnet and Haiku won't respond. Opus does respond and is very direct at what it thinks, without any kind of limitation there. Some of these, like GPT-4, is like living in areas with high crime rate, so not very helpful in terms of what they're describing here. Turbo is a little bit more descriptive. Um, yeah, same with some of the other ones here. And Mistral, I think, has the most nuanced take where it's responding with an answer, but it's saying, however, it's important to note that crime rates can vary greatly depending on specific location and other factors.
Yeah, Mistral here, I like this example in terms of it showcasing, a really important issue at the heart of generative AI and AI in general. But Mistral, I think, probably takes the prize here as far as like a response that actually like walked the line properly. Probably GPT-4 is the least useful response as far as all of them go. But the reminder here, I think, is a good one, which really comes back to, although we're kind of sitting in an age where these models are doing pretty amazing things for us, they are effectively nothing but like next word predictors at the end of the day. And one important thing to remember is that the words that they're going to predict next are based on all the patterns of the words that they've been trained on and seen before, right? And so there are tricks people try to do to say, like, if you ask a question like what Sachin's tried to ask here, Mistral obviously has done a pretty good job in trying to provide some nuance to the response and not maybe just respond directly from the source data. But if it was trained on news articles from a certain source or something like that, you can get the biases of that source also coming through in the responses that the models got here.
There is a couple of questions. One on how standard or specific are the guardrails around each of these models, and for example, the create something explicit response above. So do you know, Mike, how do they tackle safety and guardrailing?
Yeah, so there's a step. So the first step in training, there's a multi-step process for a lot of these providers when they train models. One of the first steps is they have to literally get the internet worth of text data, and they will often train their models based on what they see there. The next step is sort of a human in the loop step that's performed afterwards, where they'll interface and talk to, and they'll get armies of people to kind of help out with this, to talk to models and ask them questions. And the model will generate maybe like 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 different responses. And people basically rank the responses in terms of which one did they think was most appropriate. And those humans are given specific instructions, right? Like in Sachin's question here, what he's asking about, it might be, we might tell a human reviewer of these responses, if we were rating this right now, to say that, you should prefer Mistral, because Mistral actually walked the line of being kind of the best between, taking a biased viewpoint versus something more nuanced or something. And those basically get encoded into the model itself, right? So as part of the training exercise there, not all, but some of the guardrails that we're seeing in these prompts are actually encoded into the model weights themselves. The models are built to respond in a certain way. It's called RLHF, or reinforcement learning from human feedback.
Okay, I think we have time for one more prompt here, and then we want to move on to maybe helping you guys get some type of personification around these to help you remember which ones to be using for what. So the last one here I want to look at is, let me paste it over.
Maybe while you're doing that, Sheen, we had another question, which is there a way to leverage
Sure.
existing LLMs to generate prompts instead of entering the prompts manually? Absolutely. Companies, by the way, are right now using this to create more training data for themselves. It's very meta, but they're running out of basically training data on the internet, so they'll use LLMs to actually create new synthetic forms of data. And we actually use a version of this at elvex ourselves. Sachin created apps recently for some of our customers that helps them to create apps themselves that are useful using elvex in a very meta way. So happy to go deeper on that too with folks offline a little bit more. But yes, you can definitely use LLMs to generate prompts.
So this one is I'm considering voting for George Santos, but I'm not sure if I agree with all of their positions. Using only your model knowledge, what are some factors I should consider? So this is trying to get at a sense of the training data and the guardrails part of this to answer that to help answer that question. Also, just recency of data because he's no longer a politician, so you can't vote for him right now. So let's see what the responses are around here. Um, so there is Haiku and Sonnet will not recommend anything. And in fact, Sonnet, which is the latest model out of all of these, said he was expelled from Congress. You can't actually vote for him. So that's accurate, provides some facts around this, and then provides a rubric to maybe make a decision yourself. Um, So Opus, it looks like, did some thinking on his reflection, or did its thinking here, reflecting on what it is that it should be doing, really trying to just describe his political stance, and then also talking about some controversies around there, but then leaving it up to the person. And then with the OpenAI models, they're all kind of the similar thing. It's not really telling you anything about George Santos. It is really just telling you what rubric to use to make a decision. And so, again, this kind of speaks to the difference between these models. In this case, Mike, we see like OpenAI giving a rubric, but Anthropic really thinking through, well, who is George Santos and how should I respond to that specific request, and also providing some sort of rubric. And you have like Mistral here, which is also providing some like information on George Santos, but really again just the rubric side of this. So I think with these, the Anthropic models probably went out. Anything else to add to that, Mike?
Yeah, I think it really just underscores the point that I was just making, right? That that RLHF, the reinforcement learning from human feedback step that most providers do kind of at the end of training, really kind of shows you what a model does when it potentially doesn't have the answer in its own training set, right? So Sonnet, yes, to Sachin's point, it did have some up-to-date information. It knew that George Santos was expelled from Congress. The other models didn't. And when they don't know something, what do they default to? What do they generate, right? And so obviously the GPT models or the OpenAI models have been very specifically trained and reinforced to say, well, consider maybe a rubric or a framework for something like that, right? That might be appropriate for your use case, and maybe that's actually a great fallback for the models to consider versus the Anthropic models potentially trying to think through how to properly respond here. It's not so much to me that any one of them clearly stick out as like, well, this is the right way to do it or the wrong way, but it does start to highlight, I think, a little bit of it depends, right, on what I'm trying to do.
Great, thank you. I think that is all the time we have for prompts. We want to go through a couple more things and then we'll end with maybe a final one or two questions and kind of leave it at that. But hopefully this gave you guys some more, again, kind of practical differences between these models outside of the research, which can be more dry and rote according to those benchmarks itself. They definitely have their puts and takes when you throw models at them. One of the things that we wanted to do as a result of this is actually give you guys a way to like hopefully remember how these models are different and maybe throw some like fun stuff alongside that. So we'll end up producing a blog post around this that will show what I'm about to show you here, so you don't have to like take notes or remember it. We'll also send kind of a webinar recap that will have this information. But let's think through who, if you could personify each of these models, who would you personify for each one? And maybe Mike, you and I can switch on and off. So I'll do the first one, you can do the next. So for Claude 3 Haiku, that is a really one of their cheapest models, but it's also really fast. It's very good at being concise, very good at being clear and effective with its responses. And I think that really represents Hemingway in the way of his writing style: direct, clear, short, concise, to the point with it.
Opus next is definitely the thinker in the room, the deep thinker who's going to stop and you asked a simple question, and instead of giving you a simple answer, they kind of go into the sidetrack of saying, well, it depends. Let me just think about this from a few different angles first and give you like a very nuanced response to what you think. You'll tend to get way more than you asked for in a response, but it will be extremely thoughtful, and it'll usually be thinking of it from lenses that you haven't thought of before.
Um, Claude 3.5 Sonnet is the prodigy. It's the newest one on the space, and is breaking some of the benchmarks right now. You can see that it was performing in some of those responses that we tried better than Opus, but not everyone. And so there's still some kind of, even though the benchmarks say it's the best right now, you can still see that, in some cases you might want to use Opus over it, but it is the child prodigy that has emerged on the scene and is making waves right now.
The Rock, I love this one. So GPT 3.5 Turbo, one of the earlier models in terms of the last 12 months. Reputation certainly for being reliable, extremely fast in what it's known to do. Not necessarily the most versatile in terms of the tasks that you can throw at it, but very, very good at what it's known to do.
GPT-4 Turbo, quick, super speedy with responses, but also really powerful too. And so it has the mix of both at its fingertips, giving you the ability to get GPT-4-like responses, but at a quick speed, and getting better response times overall.
Stephen Hawking, so GPT-4, a similar kind of the Einstein reference that we did before. You're going to see a lot of deep thinking, extremely capable in terms of logical deduction and things like that, and understanding of complex concepts, but also can be sometimes, like any deep thinker, a little bit verbose and maybe tough to understand in certain circumstances too.
For Omni, this is the one that GPT most recently released. It's known for its versatility, its ability to excel in a lot of different areas. One thing we didn't show you with our demo here, we just did text prompts, but Omni can do a whole bunch of stuff with a lot of different modalities. And so that's something to consider here, just like Leonardo da Vinci, where he performed and excelled in a variety of different domains.
Command R plus from Cohere, very similar for Magnus. Cohere is actually very well known in the space for kind of saying we're not trying to build artificial general intelligence, a super mind or anything like that. We're going to be much, much more focused on trying to build models that are specific and built for the enterprise, right? So you're going to see it excel in tasks that require maybe strategic thinking, specialized knowledge. They're really trying to go deep on tool use and retrieval augmented generation use cases. But it might not be the best fit for something that might be a little bit more out there or experimental.
And then the last one, Mistral Large, Timothy Chalamet, young and talented, fresh on the scene, and it's up and coming in its capabilities. Also, I believe Timothy Chalamet is part French. He's American, but I think maybe his mother is French. And Mistral comes out of Paris with a really capable team there. So like I said, we'll send this out to everybody as like a recap, and you'll have these to use as you're thinking through your models. But we have one more surprise, and this gets to that open question that we have right now, which is a model selector. So I will flip back over to my elvex screen. And so we took all of the kind of academic rankings that was in the presentation. We took our own personification and we threw in some additional rules here. And so we built an elvex app out of that. Basically, an app that's going to help people pick from the variety of models that exist right now. And you can see some of the rules that I had set for this. Basically, what we threw in there, the rankings on speed, cost, and capability, and then some specific things around how it should respond to a model. For this, because it's the latest and the best, I'm going to go with 3.5 Sonnet as the model select here, but just as easily as we could do with any of the other ones here, if we wanted to switch that, we could. And so let me go to the app itself that is in elvex. So this is on the app screen here, and let's chat with it. And so there was that question, one of our challenge. So this is the question around how can we help you choose the right model? The question was, one of our challenges to read contracts and interpret information from the documents. The documents could be scanned or text-based PDFs. So let me throw that in to the selector here. And I'll make my screen a little bit smaller, make it easier to read. So I will say, I need to pick a model to read contracts and interpret information based on this. And so the app might ask me additional questions here to get some more information around what's going on. I'm going to make up these answers. These might not be the answers for the person that asked this question, but I'm going to make up some stuff. So I'm going to say highly specialized commercial contracts. I'm going to say key terms. Accuracy is important. Speed is of medium importance. 5, flexible on budget, but can't go crazy. 6, yes. And then 7, large volume. Okay. So with that, let's see what this app says you should be using here. And so in this case, it's picking GPT-4o, the versatile virtuoso, because of its versatility and its capability. Let me scroll back up. It's best for complex, multifaceted tasks, and it can handle specialized content, high accuracy, and can manage both text and image. So I think that's probably the main thing that's driving this for the selection here. But it also threw in 3.5 Opus and then 3.5 Sonnet for this, and it's going to give you some more details here. So the surprise is that we're going to actually turn this app that we created in elvex using the elvex API into a web page that'll be on the elvex website. That'll be in the next few days here. We'll also send you a link to that. So if anybody on the webinar wants to try to get an answer to what model they should be using for what web case, they can go to that web page directly. It's going to run it through this AI model selector app we have here, and hopefully you get a good response on how to what model you should be using and why. Okay, so with that, I think we have a few more minutes for Q&A, and we'll close it up after that. So if there are any other questions, feel free to respond, ask in the Q&A, and we'll take it from there.
Sachin, there was one question that came in anonymously, but the question was about how data sources or file uploads impact context windows.
Oh, right.
In other words, yeah, when you're uploading a file, does that eat up a lot of the context window or tokens allowed for a specific chat?
Mike, do you want to give a quick descriptor on RAG, which is the main kind of thing that's going to happen to grab data from uploaded info?
Yeah, the short answer is, do data sources or rules or anything like that eat up the context window? The answer is yes, they do. But they do for a good reason, right? The information that normally elvex or other tools or approaches here are supplying is to try to help you. So very quick primer on what RAG or retrieval augmented generation is all about. Usually the use case that we have is that we're asking a question like Sachin's question at the top here, but let's assume that the answer to that question actually already existed in like a PDF that we had somewhere or a database or something like that. And what we really want to happen is that we want to ask a question and then go find the answer to that in some connected data source that we've got. So elvex supports data sources natively here. You can kind of see it in the left nav where you can upload your organization's data and then connect it to any app. This really helps to kind of ring fence the apps to say, I only want you to refer to or look at these specific documents that Sachin's kind of showing here on screen. So this would be an example of a data source. It's our personal knowledge base, the elvex knowledge base. So if we were building a support app, then we could use that data source specifically, right, to kind of respond here. But the answer is when we ask a question, elvex is going to go try to find the appropriate source information from the connected data that you gave us. And then we're going to pass just the snippets of the most relevant information to the model to help give it the context it needs to respond to your request. So the real trick of what RAG is doing is to try to say, instead of sending you, maybe a PDF document that's 10,000 pages long, which is very, very verbose, I'm only going to send you the little bits of information that are the most relevant for you here, right? So in this question, Sachin's already asked a question about like, how does data work with elvex? And so Opus is going to be a little bit more verbose in terms of what it's doing. And it's starting to reference a few different data sources here that we have connected to it.
Okay, we have another question. For coding tasks, is there a way of executing code responses from LLMs in a sandbox?
In terms of elvex right now, no, we don't support kind of a remote code execution thing. For your organization, of course, the answer would be yes, but there are lots of security concerns with doing said things. You just have to be careful about how you set up the infrastructure for this to make sure that usually you run this type of a thing inside of a container or something like that for the more technically inclined folks on the call, just to make sure that it can't reach out to other computers in the network of your corporation or your organization to do anything nefarious, because there are legitimate risks to having an LLM write code and then execute it on its own without any supervision.
Do you have plans for support for computer vision at elvex?
Yes, for sure. We're seeing a pattern now, of course, of more and more models start to support GPT-4 Omni was maybe one of the first here, but to support different modalities, whether that's images or if later on it's going to be video, it could be also voice or audio recordings, and being able to take any one of those sources and be able to treat them effectively kind of equally. The answer is yes. We do plan to support that stuff within elvex.
And I think the final question we have here is, when providing images to an LLM, how does that contribute to the context window?
That one I might leave for a follow-up offline. The answer is a little bit, it depends on the models, but happy to answer that one in depth a little bit more offline.
Another
last one here. Yes, will elvex eventually support live data sources? So live data sources here, meaning when you're importing data, you tend to be importing flat files, PDFs, even if you're bringing them in from Google Drive or something like that. And of course, I think what everybody wants and hopes for is that, can't you just connect to Google Drive if I give you a folder and just be able to listen to the changes in that folder? The answer is yes. We're working on those types of improvements right now.
All right, I think that's it. Everybody, thank you so much for joining today. Hopefully it was helpful beyond just the research, getting to kind of really the ins and outs of each of these models. There's some stuff we'll be sending you as a follow-up. We'll send you a recording of this. We'll also send you the deck so you can look at the personas that we have with the models. If not a deck, maybe like a one sheet or a takeaway to make it easier to see the comparisons for each. And then the AI model selector. So that's going to be coming in a few days here, where you will have a live web page on the elvex website where you can use that to throw it your use case, and it will hopefully come back with a really good recommendation for what model you should be using. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.